Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, Dead by Daylight's own in-universe lore guy and keeper of the archives, The Observer. A lot of people might be surprised that I haven't dedicated a whole video to The Observer yet. But truth be told, I was waiting on the resolution and aftermath of Tome 10 to see if we got a hard and fast conclusion to The Observer's story. And the fact that we didn't is interesting. And enough of a point of discussion by itself to warrant this video being made. For those who don't know, back in early April the Observer went missing from the archives and has yet to return. And the Tome 11 and 12 archive stories were voiced over by a series of new identified voices. In his absence, I thought it wise to get some stuff out the way before his inevitable return and discuss who he is, what he's doing in the Entity's realm, and where he might have gone. Back in Tome 1, the Observer was introduced as DBD's newest lore character, and was part of the framing device for the Tome stories we got featuring the killers and survivors we knew and loved. His face was obscured and his name was unknown. All we knew about him was that he lived in the fog and spent his days poring through the memories of survivors and killers alike to learn what he could about the realm in which they were imprisoned and potentially how to escape it. As early as Tome 1, a few key characteristics of the Observer are established. He's a well-dressed late middle-aged man with a fondness for whiskey and who uses a device called the Universus to access the memories of others trapped in the realm of the Entity. Tome 1's Observer story is framed like him starting a log called the Arcus to keep track of his progress and leave a memento behind should something happen to him. Most of Tome 1's Arcus logs discuss the nature of the Entity, as a multiversal being and the embodiment of evil across realities that is both made of and feeds off the psychic energy of living beings. The Observer seems to know a lot about it, but we don't actually learn a lot about him. What we get instead, besides a little dialogue on the Entity's nature, is a teaser for two characters, a survivor and a killer. We've seen the survivor, Elodie Rakoto, come to the game since that tome released, but the other character, a woman who killed men and fed them to her pigs, has not come out. Some people say she's still coming, but it's important to remember which killer came out at the same time as Elodie, the twins. While this character obviously isn't Charlotte, an original concept for the twins was a pregnant woman where Victor would be a fetus. That concept was scrapped, but it's entirely possible that this Black Widow style figure was going to be that woman, and the character was eventually washed out and replaced with Charlotte and Victor, which I see as an absolute win because Charlotte and Victor are the best. For Tomes 1 through 3, the Observer logs were split into a few sections. The Entity, to tell us more about, the Entity. Observations, which talked about how the Observer pulled from memories of the Fog's inhabitants. And Revelations, which were more introspective and gave the Observer more of a chance to talk about himself, his own life, experiences and feelings of being trapped in the fog. These early Tome entries were crucial to establishing the Observer as someone who was a step beyond everybody else we've met so far, as he watches the memories of the survivors and killers and even Vigo, a character we've never seen much of and with whom the Observer is fascinated. We learn about his life prior to entering the fog. He lived in a universe called Terra Primus, a human civilization far in advance of our own, with technology that to us today would seem like magic. Terra Primus seems to be vaguely Roman-inspired, as we can tell by the Terra Primus coin and the Latin-ish names that pervade the stories. The Aurus, the Arcus, the Terra Worlds, etc. The last thing we needed to paint our complete starting picture of the Observer was the Aurus, the device that gives him his power and the most recognisable symbol of the archives. It's a tool that allows the Observer to manifest objects he can imagine into reality, and view the memories of others, navigating the murky mindscape of the fog like a ship guided by a lighthouse. Without it, he'd just be a normal, slightly alcoholic middle-aged man. But this artifact from Terra Primus is what allows him to maintain his tower, and continue his research away from the prying eyes of the Entity, at least for now.
This is my own private domicile and I will not be harassed! Bitch!
It's powered by something the people of Terra Primus called the Trinitarian of Creation. The combination of thought and emotion to create something material. This is treated as a constant law that pervades all universes that the Aurus is able to focus into physical objects. But the full implications of that principle aren't really touched on for a while longer, so we're going to put a pin in that for now, because we will come back to it. Tomes 1 to 3 serve to paint us a complete, if pretty static picture of who the Observer is, where he comes from and what he's doing now, That's all they needed to do. Since he's not a playable character and honestly more of a framing device for DBD's lore archives, he doesn't need to be an incredibly complex character from the get-go. We just need the bare minimum to make his role as that framing device make sense. It wasn't until Tome 4 that we started to look more into the psyche of the Observer himself, to see him more as a character than just a means to deliver lore to Dead by Daylight's player base. We get to see more of how this life collecting memories, getting shit-faced and playing golf affects him psychologically, and it's pretty fucked by all accounts. You might think he has it pretty good, at least compared to the survivors who are beaten and tortured to death effectively for all eternity, but the survivors, importantly, don't remember it. The entity feeds on emotions, and to facilitate a constant flow of those emotions, the survivors have their memories wiped every time they die, so that their fear is fresh and the desire to escape persists. While the survivors are condemned to forget, the Observer is condemned to remember everything he goes through, and with time in the entity's realm a flexible and inconsistent concept, it rapidly starts to do a number on his mental state. This can be seen by the formerly rigid structure of the Arcus logs decaying into single stories, focusing entirely on the Observer's experience. Tome 4 starts out with Through the Looking Glass, as the Observer slips gradually into madness. But Tome 5 Salitas Alionis, The Sanity of Alion, is the most upfront about the Observer's debilitating mental state. Tome 4 starts with the Observer detailing his daily life, his periods of relaxation to recover from his work as he listens to horror stories on the radio conjured by the Auris. It's all very tranquil, actually. For a moment the Observer gets to reflect on his life here, all alone in the tower, but something keeps reaching out to him. It shows him windows into other worlds, peaceful worlds with life and civilization, people, the kind of mortal luxuries we take for granted, but that the Observer has been denied for all these years. It's only at the end of the story that he realises what is going on, and what is showing him these tantalising and immaterial visions.
I have seen into the heart of this old one, and have seen things no mortal eyes should see. Things that simultaneously perplex my mind and burden my conscience. With mysterious help I have ripped open reality, searched deep within countless rifts, and seen everything tumble helplessly toward chaos and entropy, toward death and madness. And for the briefest moment I had the ridiculous thought that the mysterious ally helping me could very well be the entity, playing its game with me, toying with me as a cat does a mouse before the claw rips the tiny jugular out. Staring out into the endless abyss of black fog, I thought that this prison could very well be another form of trial, disguised and designed to feast on all the psychic energies derived from alienation, boredom, and all those bouts of unremembered insanity. I can't help but feel millions of invisible hooks in my heart, and millions of unseen eyes all around me, watching me, waiting for me to tumble toward chaos and madness like everything else, waiting for my mind to turn against itself. This bastard of an old one wants me to kill myself, I am sure of it, or maybe I already have, and maybe I will again, and again, and again.
This realisation that the entity can reach him, that it's playing with him just like the survivors in the trials, sets up Tome 5's story, Sanitas Alionis, probably the darkest Observer story to date. His records, normally precise and comprehensive, become patchy and hard to decipher as his memory starts to degrade and he frantically speculates as to what might be going on, desperately reaching for anything he can find to make sense of this nightmare. Even at the start of the memory, as he finds bodies from people he knew in the days before the tower, indicate that all is not well with him, and he is nowhere near as stable as he'd always come across. Keeping a list of all the people who've wronged you so you can manifest copies of them to brutally murder as stress release? That's pretty fucked up, and goes to show how far his prison term in the tower has driven him. In Tome 5, we don't see the Observer, the studious and methodical man endeavouring to destroy the entity for good. Instead, we see Alion, the vengeful, bitter, insane man beating people to death with a golf club and rendered utterly helpless in the face of the entity's overwhelming power. Oh, and that's his name, by the way. Alion. If Sanitas Alionis is anything to go by, at least. While I think Thanatos Alionis might not be the best Observer story, I think it's by far the most important for setting the tone of the rest would go on to follow. Up until then, it became very easy to just not care about the Observer very much, because he was never really in any danger. His story had no stakes because he was safely ensconced in his tower, and we didn't really know enough about him to care about him as a person to give us those emotional stakes. Tome 5 flips that on his head by reminding us that, regardless of how safe Allion thinks he is, this is the entity's realm, and at the end of the day, he's just a man trying to kill a god. The only reason the entity hasn't squashed him like a bug yet is because it's too much fun to watch him struggle. Now, I'm glad Tome 5 decided to go there as a psychological exploration of the extra-dimensional shitfuck the Observer finds himself in, but I'm also glad the tomes that followed stepped away from it a little bit and decided to expand the scope of the Observer stories. Leaving the brutality of Alion's madness to a single story, I think helps maintain its impact. Yeah, we know he's crazy, let's move on. As to where we moved on to... Do you remember the thing I said earlier about the Trinitarian of creation? Thought and emotion combining to make a physical object? Well, it turns out that applies to DBD's entire multiverse, except in reverse and on a much broader scale. The Observer espouses a theory called the Universus Alveo, the complete channeling in Latin, that claims that stories written by someone in one universe can be reality in another. The Observer claims that humans have some sort of inbuilt networking capability that allows us to unconsciously connect with our counterparts in other universes, and creatives like artists and storytellers bring fragments of those counterparts' lives back with them. What is non-fiction in one world becomes fiction in another. This revelation sticks with the Observer as he pours through the pages of the Chamber of Blood, a room in his tower full of stories, fiction and non-fiction alike, that those who came before him have used to help them make sense of the entity's mad world. Some of these stories are grisly tales of horror in pulp magazines, others are just nonsensical ravings. But in many of these stories, one name keeps cropping up, one that by now we should all be familiar with. Tome 6 marked the debut of our very own Haddie Core.
You're breathtaking!
I've made a video on Haddie already, and if you haven't seen it, I'd recommend you do. But the more stories the Observer reads in the Chamber of Blood in Tome 6 and 7, the more unsure you are about whether what you're reading is fact or fiction, or more likely, both. Tome 7 handled this ambiguity perfectly. In one memory, Haddie's uncle Stefan is drinking coffee and musing over his latest vampire story. In another, Haddie and Jordan are fighting actual vampires. The implication here is that as part of his creative process, Stefan sees Haddie and Jordan fighting vampires in another universe and turns that into a story in his universe, all totally unconsciously. The next few tomes mostly leave the Observer himself out of the picture, or at least don't focus on him quite as much, in favour of exploring the mad worlds of horror stories the Observer investigates in the Chamber of Blood. Some are dark and grisly, like the man haunted by the spirits of the dogs that he's killed. Others are just bizarre and funny, like Emperor Dwight, who greets his subjects with bubblegum tuna and pizza for all. The one given the most attention, however, is Terra Arachna, a world overrun by horrifying spider monsters that manifest itself not in the mind of a storyteller, but in the mind of a lunatic who feels the spiders scratching in the flesh in the back of his head. Terra Arachna forms the basis of Tomes 8 and 9 and represents some of the last things the Observer himself takes notes on. A world ridden by an infestation of gigantic spiders and a black fog containing thousands of microscopic spider eggs that hatch from human and animal hosts explosively. Tome 8 has the Observer uncover news reports from Fall City, near Carlson's hometown in her original lore, where what is implied to be an alternate universe version of Nia is dragged off and killed by the spiders, and her friend Casey becomes a host to a nest of them. Meanwhile, Tome 9 covers the efforts to find a toxin capable of killing the spiders, featuring one Dr. Morell and her friend, a hapless office worker turned pizza chef who is quite clearly meant to be the Terra Arachna version of Dwight Fairfield. These stories might feel inconsequential, like cheap fan service, or you can see alternate universe versions of Claudette and Dwight and get teasers for new characters like Haddie. But there's something more at work that Tome 9 cinematic starts to really hint at. If you gaze too long into the abyss will gaze back into you. And as the Observer peers tirelessly into the memories and stories of the multiverse, that has consequences. At the end of Tome 9, several of the spiders from Terra Arachna make their way into the Observer's tower, suggesting that the Observer's meddling in other realities is about to come back to bite him. But it gets worse when you realise that the spiders in Terra Arachna were directly sent by the entity, which is how they transmitted in that black fog. And if the spiders have found him and settled into his tower, it's only a matter of time before the entity takes notice and takes interest in him once again. Let's skip forward to Tome 10, our first fully licensed tome that came with a beautiful colour animation showing us the Observer squaring off with what appears to be Saw's own Billy the Puppet. Let's just sit back and watch it for a sec, because there's a lot that I want to unpack.
Hello. I want to play a game. Stories and memories are like pieces of a puzzle. Your obsession with other lives has undermined your own existence. Your life descends into madness as you desperately search for the missing piece. The piece that will reveal a way out. Here is my gift. A clue. What you have been looking for has been right in front of you, all along. You just have to look beyond your obsession. Will you continue to lose yourself in other lives? Or will you take a moment to see, to really see? Your mind can be your sanctuary or your prison. The choice is, and always has been, yours to make.
Yeah, that really is the voice of horror legend Tobin Bell as Jigsaw for this cinematic. Anybody who knows my channel knows how much I fucking love Saw, and I can't tell you how happy I was when I saw this entire cinematic. I had so much Saw brain rot it wasn't even funny. Second, it's very obvious that this isn't the John Kramer or Billy the Puppet that we know and love. The spider leg sprouting out of its back suggests that it is simply the entity communicating with the Observer in a form that he can understand. A symbol of pain and death reforged to fit the entity's purposes. This marks the first time in DBD history the entity communicates directly and transparently to someone, and it's utterly terrifying. Just like Billy did to all of Jigsaw's victims, the entity has left the Observer with a terrible choice: to confront his obsession, look inside himself to find the answers he needs, or be left to his own maddening addiction to the lives of others. This is not only an excellent fit to Saw's long-running theme of addiction and John Kramer seeing himself as a way to cure it, but also foreshadows what will happen to the Observer in Tome 11 cinematic, but we'll get there soon. But there's one very important detail that's so obvious, I'm surprised no one talks about it much. Did anyone else see Billy just, break the fucking Auris? Like, this isn't just some cheap gimmick to look good in the cinematic either. It doesn't go back to normal at the end, and this is the last time the Observer is ever shown using it. He doesn't have it in the Tome 10 or 11 cinematics, and remember what I said earlier? The Auris is the source of the Observer's power, and how he's been able to keep himself safe from the horrors of the fog all these years. Now that it's gone, he's just a man, and the entity is done playing with its food. The Tome 10 cinematic showcases that all is not well in Observer Land. The monsters are breaching his chambers again, and he has to fight them off with his golf club. This isn't the first time the Observer has had to defend himself and the tower from a breach, but it is the first time he's had to do it without the Auris. And I do wish we had a bit more story stuff in the tomes to go along with these animations. All the stories focus basically entirely on the Chamber of Blood stuff, and I'd like to see how the Observer reacts to the walls effectively closing in around him without the Auris to help protect himself. Instead, we stick to the alternate universe exploration we've been doing since Tome 6, with particular emphasis on two of them, featured in the stories 12 to Midnight and The Red Crane. I won't be covering these right now, because this video is really about the Observer himself, but there'll be another video I'll do covering the House of Arkham stories, so don't worry. Across several of the tomes, it's implied that the Allion that we know and love isn't the only Observer kicking around the fog, or at least, he isn't the only one who ever has. Even as early as Tome 1 he's finding files and notes from someone who occupied the tower before him, and in the Tome 6 cinematic he even finds a body that, aside from a longer beard and more ragged clothing, looks identical to his own. Whether this is his actual corpse sent back in time, an alternate version of himself, or just an illusion put there by the entity to fuck with him, isn't explored, but I have my theories. Those theories seem to have been proven with the arrival of Tome 11 in April this year, which was heralded by the disappearance of the Observer from his normal spot in his tower. The Owless is still dead, and there's signs of a struggle, implying he left in a rush and likely not voluntarily, and theories abounded as to what had happened to him, including but not limited to him escaping the fog altogether, the spiders from Tome 9 getting him at last, or that I'd broken into the tower and locked him out. Yeah, I had that art commissioned as a new channel banner back in March, and had no idea how outstandingly convenient it was going to be. This leads us to the Tome 11 cinematic, which is the last we've seen of the Observer to date, and he's not having the best time. Turns out his rooftop scuffle with the big gribbly monsters didn't go completely well, as his beard is long and his clothes are ragged. But as he heads back to the tower to continue his work, he finds... and that's the last we see of him. The Observer stories in Tome 11 and 12 are voiced by someone else entirely, and he's not present in any capacity in the Tome 11 or 12 stories, or the Tome 12 cinematic. So for all intents and purposes, the Observer has vanished. While we don't know for sure what happened to him, I believe his meddling has finally caught up to him. That body we see in the armchair in Tome 6 I'm pretty sure is the real him. He's as bedraggled and unshorn as he is in the Tome 11 cinematic, and the 12 to Midnight and Red Crane stories have been carried on without him. But that doesn't mean he's dead at this exact moment. The tower seems to be inherited by a new group of explorers in the fog who are likely to fill the role of the new Observer going forwards. We don't know a lot about these guys. The only one we even have a name for is James Rich, a scriptwriter and Lovecraft fan who has given the Observer's former domicile a new name, one fitting the cosmic horror story the group has found themselves embroiled in: the House of Arkham. That leaves us with just one simple question. Will we ever see the Observer again? Honestly, I don't know for sure. I'm inclined to believe we'll see something about him, whether it just be clues to his existence in the future House of Arkham stories, or potentially his arrival into the game proper as a survivor or even a killer. But there is that corpse we saw in Tome 6, so it really wouldn't surprise me if there really was the final resting place of Allion. If so, it'd be a somewhat ignominious end. A pretty abrupt finale for a character who's defined DBD storytelling for almost 3 years. I'm glad we've moved into an interesting new era for DBD's lore and got a whole new cast of characters to get to know. I just wish his story had maybe ended with a little more flair. Of course, it might not be the end for our man Allion, and even if it is, you can't say that the most written about character in DBD history didn't have a good showing. More than what he meant as a character or as a framing device for the archives, the Observer symbolised Dead by Daylight finally taking its storytelling and world building seriously, and by departing from him, I hope that's a sign in behaviour's confidence to tell compelling new stories without him, and not an abandonment of what he represented.
Well, that's everything I have to say about the Observer. What do you reckon of the character of the Observer? Do you think he's necessary? Do you think he was given a good showing? And do you think the new characters are going to be as interesting? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. While you're down there, I'm going to do the YouTuber ritual of press the buttons that do the engagement. Yeah, there's links to things like my Patreon and Discord and whatnot if you want to see the videos early. Yeah, sorry about how brief this is. The new mid-chapter will have a new tome and some other stuff I have opinions on, and it's just been leaked that For Honor is likely to be the next chapter, so holy shit, I have a lot of work to do. I guess I'll just see you then. Bye. Oh, next video is going to be Evil Dead. That's important. Yeah, Evil Dead.